Hi, I'm Basil, and this is Anu, and we're with the King County Auditor's Office. Today we'll be talking about our audit on grants programs managed by the King County Parks and Recreation Division. These programs used to grant about $3 million each year, but they grew in 2020 when King County voters approved the 2020 to 2025 Parks Levy. That levy tasked the Parks Division with granting approximately $90 million in additional funding over the next 6 years. The recently adopted 2026 to 2031 Parks Levy continues this approximate level of funding, despite some changes to individual grant programs. Generally, Parks processes for managing grants may have been reasonable for the original smaller amount of funding, but we found opportunities for improvements given the growth in these grants programs that started in 2020. In our audit, we had 4 key findings. First, there's a lack of clear and measurable objectives for Parks grants programs. Second, there were gaps in Parks monitoring of individual grant outcomes. Third, financial oversight is not yet aligned with grant size and complexity. And finally, that gaps in financial policies may increase risk. I'll talk a bit more about these first 2 findings areas and then hand it off to Anu to dive deeper into financial oversight. First, we found that Parks grants programs do not yet have clear or measurable objectives. Most Parks grants programs are outlined in the Parks Levy package with broad direction and goals defined by Council. We found that Parks has not yet created specific and measurable objectives to implement these broad goals, which means it can't evaluate its grant program's performance yet. I'm going to show an example to explain a little more tangibly. This first example is not related to Parks. It's just to help explain the difference between goals and objectives. Then I'll show an example relating to Parks to tie things together. So an example goal for the county, again, unrelated to Parks, might be to reduce smoking. An objective would take that goal and make it more specific, more measurable, and more actionable. In this case, it could be something like, by 2030, decrease the rate of smoking in the county by 25%. For the Healthy Communities and Parks Grants Program, a goal outlined in the levy package is to increase access and use of parks, open spaces, recreational facilities, and related programming in underserved areas. What we found was that Parks has not created specific and measurable objectives for this goal or the goals of its other grants programs. This means that Parks has that broad direction from the goal in that bottom left-hand corner, but doesn't have specifics about what the goal looks like in practice. The lack of specificity makes it harder for Parks to achieve its grants program's goals. To fill this gap, we make recommendations to create those specific and measurable objectives to guide grant program operations and reporting. We also found gaps in Parks monitoring of individual grant performance. During the grant process, Parks requires that grantees submit scopes of work, progress reports, and final reports. We found that the documents submitted by grantees were vague or had insufficient information for Parks to do meaningful monitoring of grant performance. The lack of information in these scopes of work, progress reports, and final reports means that Parks does not know how much each grant advances its grants program's goals. In other words, how effective the grant is. Here are some examples of scopes of work we reviewed. This first one is a sample from a different King County grants program, not Parks. This grant aims to improve water quality education in schools, and its deliverables include detailed information about the number of schools and students and its strategy for achieving these goals. Notice how the expected deliverables contain information that can be used to monitor the grant's progress and success. How many schools did they partner with? How many students and teachers did they engage with? These are very clear, measurable things. We can compare this against a sample from a Parks grant we reviewed. Notice how there is less detail in the deliverables, which is just to share updates via progress reports that are already required for every grant. The deliverables here aren't specific, measurable, or relevant to the stated grant activity on the left. This makes it hard for Parks staff to determine whether the grant was effective and whether it advanced the grants program's goals. To fill these gaps, we make recommendations for parks to make its scopes of work and grant deliverables more specific and improve its process for monitoring individual grant outcomes. With that, I'll hand it to Anu to get into our findings relating to financial oversight.
Thanks, Basil. Before I get into the financial findings, let me tell you a little bit about how many grants Parks manages. In 2023 and 2024, Parks awarded 288 grants. Of those, more than half were under $20,000, though award amounts range from as low as a few $1,000s to over $1 million. Grants also varied in project type, with some grants being awarded to fund programs like a summer basketball camp for kids to building a new park. For most Parks grants, grantees pay first and then get reimbursed later. And Parks requires detailed invoices and significant paperwork for every grant to support expenses before they are reimbursed. Grantees must submit documentation regardless of whether costs are for a cup of coffee or for a larger capital project expense. That brings us to our finding. Although there is some variation in how capital and program grant projects are managed, Parks uses essentially the same financial review process for every grant, whether it's a $2,000 award or a $1 million one. Most grants, as we saw on the previous slide, are under $20,000. So this approach may not consistently direct staff effort to where oversight has the greatest value. One aspect of risk to consider is size and complexity. And when oversight isn't aligned with grant size and complexity, two things happen. First, larger or more complex grants may not always get the extra scrutiny they need. Conversely, smaller grants and grantees may face documentation requirements that may be more burdensome than necessary. Second, staff time isn't used as efficiently as possible, since staff may apply the same level of review to smaller, more straightforward grants as to larger or more complex awards. This increases the county's exposure to financial risk while stretching limited capacity. To ensure oversight is aligned with grant size, complexity, and risk, we recommend Parks adopt a risk-based financial strategy to help focus oversight where it's most needed without overburdening smaller grantees. Parks does have some policies that explain what types of costs are allowed at a high level. Where we identified a gap is that certain expense types are not described in enough detail to support consistent interpretation and review. Two examples are prepaid cards, such as transit passes, and stipends provided to individuals. Even when these are used for valid program purposes, these expenses can be challenging to track without clear guidance and are at higher risk for being spent on personal items. We also found that while policies say what costs are allowed, they don't always explain how those costs should be documented or reviewed. Without clear guidance, grantees may not know what's allowed, and staff may have trouble reviewing them consistently. This lack of detail can lead to different interpretations and inconsistent oversight. We saw something similar when we looked at indirect costs. Indirect costs are real, necessary expenses that support a project but can't be tied to a single activity. These include things like administrative staff, rent, utilities, and general office overhead for things like computers. Right now, indirect costs are capped at 20% for Parks grantees. However, grantees are not required to provide documentation showing the types of expenses included in those indirect costs. Even when everyone is acting in good faith, this lack of detail can make it difficult to prevent the same expense from being counted twice. For example, a computer included as both a direct and an indirect cost. If this happens, fewer grant dollars would be available for other community programs. To support clear and consistent oversight of grant expenditures, we recommend that Parks clarify policies for certain expense types and update its indirect cost policy to strengthen oversight. To recap, here are 4 key takeaways in our audit and in this presentation. First, there's a lack of clear and measurable objectives for parks grants programs. Second, there are gaps in parks monitoring of individual grant outcomes. Third, financial oversight is not yet aligned with grant size and complexity. And last, that gaps in financial policies may increase risk. Thank you for listening. You can find our report on our website. Appreciate it.